In this segment, we're going to talk about the origin of life on Earth. We want to go through when did life begin? So we want to develop a timeline of life. Now, what do we mean by the word life? This is actually a very difficult question to answer. So maybe we should just say what life is. It's the opposite of death or dead things. So it's, in other words, it's not dead. So when we talk about the origin of life or when life began, we're really talking about microscopic life. Microscopic creatures in the oceans. Life began way back when as single cellular. So let's look at this word cellular, specifically cell and cellular. A cell is the smallest structural and functional unit of an organism. Here is a cartoon from your text showing you an example of what a cell looks like. It has a membrane, which is the outer structure, which transports raw material and finished products. And it contains a nucleus, which is your information storage location. Now, cells manufacture proteins and enzymes, and they also produce energy. Now, what is shown in your cell are these four objects, and those are going to be your DNA molecules. Now, just to give you an idea, a single cell from a human being contains about 1.5 meters of DNA and about 4.5 billion base pairs, enough to record the entire works of Shakespeare 200 times. A typical adult human contains a total of about 600 astronomical units of DNA. Yet the DNA in each cell contains all the information that is needed to create a new human, a clone. But we're not talking about these human cells, because human cells aren't the cells we're talking about as when life began in the oceans, as microscopic creatures, as single cellular. What we're talking about here is bacteria or bacterial life. So think of this bacteria, this single cell, as a single bacteria. This is what we mean by the earliest forms of life as single cellular. Now, how do we know? Well, let's go look for the oldest remains of colonies of life on Earth, specifically fossilized remains. So what we're looking at in this photo from your text is the oldest fossils, which are the remains of sea creatures. These oldest fossils are called stromatolites, and these are the fossilized remains of colonies of single-celled organisms. These stromatolites are colonies of microorganisms which are more complex than individual cells. We don't really have any photographs of individual cells, earliest, simpler organisms. What we have here is colonies of these single cellular organisms. So this stromatolite that we're looking at is a layered fossil formation, and you can see the layers right through here. And this layered fossil formation is caused by ancient mats of algae or bacteria that build up mineral deposits season after season. So we don't see the individual bacteria. That would be single cellular. What we're looking at is mats of bacteria. And not even that, we're looking at the fossilized remains of the mats of bacteria. Specifically, this fossil stromatolite came from Western Australia, and it is more than 3 billion years old. It presents us some of the oldest evidence of life on Earth. And what we mean by life is this single cellular bacteria, in this case, groupings of this bacteria. Now, this stromatolite is found near or in shallow water, where they're repeatedly covered by sediments. So this tells us that early forms of life had to occur in or very near water. So here in this cartoon, this is an artist rendition of what the artist thought Earth might have looked like 3 billion years ago. We're looking at the early Earth. And what we see here is we see some volcanoes and it's spewing out some gas, giving us our early forms of early atmosphere. And here's our stromatolite mats that are down here in the water, as you can see. These stromatolite bacterial mats are growing near the shores of an ocean where the water comes in and repeatedly over layers, covers over with this sedimentation. Now this is 3 billion years ago, and so life must have begun in or very near the water. Well, what about on land? What about life on land? Well, life on land would need to have some kind of oxygen because it needs to be able to breathe. So the stromatolites would use photosynthesis, and it would be able to add oxygen into the early Earth's atmosphere. So once oxygen was in the atmosphere and we had this ozone layer, life was able to develop further onto land. But it took a long time to get to that point. Once life was able to start on land, it took off into this explosion called the Cambrian explosion, when life grew with abundance of kinds of species. An example would be the trilobites. The trilobites are a fossil group of extinct marine life, meaning multicellular extinct marine life. Now, the smallest trilobites were almost microscopic in size, very, very tiny, but the largest were bigger than a dinner plate. Here's an example right here. That one is about the size of your hand. It existed about 400 million years ago in an ocean floor that is now a limestone deposit in the state of Pennsylvania in the United States of America. Compared to stromatolites that existed billions of years ago, this is a fossil group of marine life that existed millions of years ago. So in this cartoon image from your textbook, it's an artist's rendition of what that artist thought maybe the ocean looked like millions of years ago when we were in this Cambrian explosion, the start of the Cambrian period. Well, what about human life? When did human life come around? Well, to know when humans came about, we have to go look at the entire timeline of the origin of life. So let's look at the left side of the diagram. In the left side of the diagram, we have an axis from bottom to top. So at the top, it is now, and at the very bottom, this is when Earth formed. So compared to now, this would be 1 billion years ago. This would be 2 billion years ago. This would be 3 billion years ago. And so right around here, in 3 billion years ago, that is when the stromatolites were forming. And if we continue on, so this would be where 4 billion years ago is, and this would be 4.6, and that is when the Earth began. So you can see for the first billion years or so, there wasn't any life that was around. Stromatolites first formed, and then if we're going to talk about the trilobites, we would have to go all the way up here. That's when the trilobites formed. So now we're getting up into the very tiny portion of the axis, and notice we have blue colors, greens, orange, and orange colors, and that we can expand this axis out, and we can now see this is where the Cambrian explosion is, right here where the trilobites are. So if you follow along, this would be now, and now is when the age of humans is occurring. Humans are newcomers to the timeline of the origin of life. Let's compress the entire 4.6 billion years into one calendar year, as shown on this very left axis. So we're going to put January 1st at the very beginning of the formation of Earth, and we're going to put December 31st at the very end, or today. Let's assume today would be December 31st in a calendar year. So on January 1st, you would not see any signs of life, and you wouldn't see any kind of life at all until about March or April when the stromatolites started to form. So remember, that is your very simple-celled bacteria that eventually forms bacterial mats and takes a long time through photosynthesis to put oxygen into Earth's atmosphere, for an ozone layer to form, and then finally for life to evolve onto Earth. So in a calendar year, you would have to wait around till November until you would finally see the trilobites form and other complex organisms during this Cambrian explosion. Specifically, to see land forming on the Earth, you would have to wait till beyond the Thanksgiving holiday in the United States of America. But once complex life formed on land, it would explode and you would have all kinds of life forming. So if November 28th is when we have the first day of when we start to have these trilobites form and evolve onto the land, then you would wait around till December 12th and the first dinosaurs would start to appear walking on the continents. The dinosaurs would then be gone by the Christmas day or maybe the day after Christmas. And once the dinosaurs are gone, the last week of the year you would see the rise of mammals and birds. So they would start populating the lands and the air on the Earth. So when did the humans start to populate the Earth? You would have to wait until the late afternoon on New Year's Eve to find the first humans walking on the Earth. Humans are newcomers to the timeline of the origin of life. Humans would be developing the very first stone tools somewhere in the late evening. The Stone Age would end around 11:59 p.m., after which the first towns and then the first cities would appear. In the last 30 seconds of the year, right before New Year's Day begins, you would have all kinds of things happening. Babylon would flourish, the pyramids would rise, Troy would follow, the Christian era would begin right before the new year. Rome would fall, the Middle Ages and the Renaissance would be just a glimmer of the past. The American and French revolutions would occur, and 1.5 seconds before the end of the New Year's Eve. As you can see, intelligent life only began in the last few seconds of the year. Humans are latecomers to the timeline of the origin of life.